So, Dr. Stoltz, we're here today to discuss George Washington's leadership style, but specifically as it pertains to this idea of national crisis. We are going through one right now, but we might make some connections to that. What would you say were some of the most relevant national crises of the George Washington administration, whether health-related like ours or anything else significant?
Yeah, well, there were actually quite a few, and it's maybe worth even taking a second to just think back on, right, that the Washington administration is operating under the Constitution, which was itself a response to a crisis. After the American Revolution, the U.S. is under the Articles of Confederation and a system of government that had proved quite lacking at times in the peace that followed the war. And so really right from the start, the Washington administration is dealing with sort of a longstanding economic and political crisis of just getting the U.S. government up and running after the war in sort of a steady state environment. During the war, they have the advantage that the American revolutionaries can be sort of politically unified in being not British, but being not something is not the same thing as being for something. And so once the war is over, it really starts to highlight the policy differences and different policy outcomes that different folks around the country are looking for, those that are involved in the politics. So there is sort of a general, just in that the first term of Washington's administration, just sort of a general feeling of crisis at the start. But there are some sort of specific crises that are worth sort of bringing up that might sound timely to us today. There were a number of different what they in the 18th and 19th century they were called panics. So sudden sharp downturns in the financial markets that had occurred, and this is at a period where they're trying to, especially people like Alexander Hamilton are trying to establish trust and confidence in this new national banking system that they're trying to get online, or that some folks are trying to get online. And so there's one sort of specific panic in 1792 it's resolved by sort of a prototype version of what we would call today quantitative easing, injecting capital into the financial markets to try and keep liquidity available. But really the first shocking crisis that the Congress and the presidency have to deal with. It was a military incident called St. Clair's Defeat in 1791, same year that the bank bill was first passed. Where, and on the one hand, this will sound really impressive, but then I'll sort of add some context. Where essentially the entire U.S. Army is wiped out in one battle with Native Americans in what's going to become Ohio. It was about 4,000 person army, or the U.S. Army is not that big of an organization at that point, intentionally so, because of friends of people like Thomas Jefferson. They want a very small army, but the entire army is wiped out in one battle, basically. And Congress, not surprisingly, would like to do an investigation and get to the bottom of that. And I think that really starts to set the tone for how we see Washington manage a lot of these a number of the crises and incidents that will come up. Which is that Congress asked for very specific documents, right? And so it brings up sort of the first incidents of executive privilege. And so Alexander Hamilton is advising George Washington. Alexander Hamilton's Secretary of the Treasury at that point, but he's if you've all seen the play or listened to the soundtrack for Hamilton, he's very close advisor to the president. And Hamilton's arguing that not only that Washington shouldn't turn over the documents to Congress, that he needs to set a precedent for executive privilege, that there are going to be certain types of documents that just shouldn't be handed over. And Washington actually will overrule Hamilton and say not only should they turn over exactly the documents that Congress asked for, they should turn over the documents that Congress didn't even know to ask for. So really erring on the side of transparency, with the idea that that would be a move that would establish trust between the executive and legislative branch and the government and the citizenry and the electorate, so that if Washington was to have to invoke executive privilege, it could be trusted that it would be for a good reason. Does that make sense? So that, that if I need to tell you I can't tell you. You can have the trust that I'm doing it for. I have a reason to do it, and it's not just playing some game of politics. And so there were a few other ones. Probably the two most famous are the Whiskey Rebellion, when there ends up being a fairly large-scale insurrection in Western Pennsylvania, where there's a lot of folks that don't want to pay their taxes on the first excise tax in U.S. history, which will be on whiskey. Washington will have to mobilize a large portion of the state militias. He'll actually personally take the army out into the militia army, right? Not the U.S. Army. That's something we can sort of talk about later if we want. But he takes out the militia, right? Essentially the equivalent today of the National Guard, under state control. Takes them out, and it's actually the third largest army he ever commanded in his life. It's actually larger than the army he has at the final battle of the war at Yorktown. And they will put sort of negotiate into the rebellion. The other sort of most famous one is that in the midst of almost the entire Washington administration, the French Revolution is going on. And so there's sort of an ongoing foreign policy crisis that will become more or less acute in different times, where the U.S. is just trying to have to figure out how does it navigate this international crisis, where you have its old ally France, but you have a country that it's close trading partner with, England, and the two of them are trying to both pull the U.S. into their side of the French Revolution. And so, the Washington administration is trying to steer sort of a neutral path through that, because Washington just doesn't feel like the U.S. Has the need or frankly the ability to get involved in this conflict. And lastly, and I know this is one that Eric, you're eager to talk about. There was sort of an ongoing series of yellow fever outbreaks across the eastern seaboard of the United States, starting in 1793 and really continuing all the way until the end of 1800. And so there is even a somewhat equivalent epidemiological, is that the right word? Not that kind of doctor, I'm a PhD, not an MD. Incident that is sort of which brings up the question: what is the role of the U.S. government in the middle of an epidemic? And I'll stop talking for a bit because I'm sure we're going to discuss that one more.
Yeah, certainly. And it sounds to me, as we start to catalog the leadership lessons of Washington, it sounds like the first one, if I were to summarize your words, was that he saw executive privilege as something to invoke rather than something to waive. Might be a way to put that, and we'll see what other lessons. Might peg that as lesson number one. You mentioned the U.S. government, so let's just go a little more basic for a second and say, what was the federal government then? I often start introductory sessions with our interns or students interested in internships by asking if anyone knows how many federal government agencies exist today. It's somewhat of a trick question. I won't make people guess here, but there's really no known answer, but it's definitely hundreds. What was the federal government then? When you say the U.S. government, what does that look like? What are you referring to?
Yeah, no, that's one that with a lot of our government guests that come out to the estate for my programs, we play this sort of a similar game with them. During Washington's administration, not counting the U.S. military, right? So that was sort of non-military employees of the federal government. The entire federal government consisted at sort of the height of Washington's administration of around 1,300 employees. The vast majority of those folks are postal. That's folks working with the Postal Service, port tax collectors. The U.S. government at that point's primary way of making money is through import and export tariffs and taxes. So you have to have someone there to collect the taxes. The Revenue Cutter Service, basically the predecessor of the Coast Guard, was considered a civilian agency. At that point, it did not fall under, nowadays what would be the Department of Defense. And I think for a lot of our groups, the one that surprises them the most is the law enforcement capacity or lack thereof of the U.S. government. In Washington's administration, the only real law enforcement officers for the entire federal government are the U.S. Marshals, and there's only 13 of them. there's one per state. So that creates some interesting law enforcement challenges. So in terms of what was the federal government, it's there, but it's very nascent. That's for a reason, but not necessarily by choice of people like Washington and Alexander Hamilton. There's definitely, even in that sort of founding era, huge debate over what is the purpose and role of government and how big should government be. So not much, but not as much as Washington himself would have probably liked.
What do you have any insights on the change in that between now and then? Was it gradual, just kind of consistent over time? Are there any specific events that mark that? And I've been looking forward to asking this question. I don't know to what extent it's an opinion or answerable question, but do we have any way of assuming what President Washington would think of today's federal government?
Yeah, well, I think in terms of the change, it's definitely a gradual process. It was funny. I was actually, just taking some notes for this beforehand, just to kind of, prep for it. And it really is a gradual process. And it's interesting that, we make that. I myself just made that distinction between the civilian employees of the federal government and the U.S. military. And the U.S. federal workforce is quite small throughout the 18th and 19th century in terms of civilian employees. But the U.S. military, especially the U.S. Army, ends up being called on numerous times to sort of backfill roles that we would think of today as being done by civilian agencies. So whether it was, disaster response, today what we would think of stuff that FEMA or the National Guard is obviously still involved in it, and it's the National Guard now sort of a hybrid between what would have been the U.S. Army and the militia in the 18th and 19th centuries. But even in terms of functions today that are being done by Health and Human Services or the CDC or DHS, in many cases were done by the U.S. military at different points during the 19th century. So, for example, we'll kind of stick with the yellow fever connection here for a moment. I'm from New Orleans originally, and in New Orleans, yellow fever was just associated with the summer. It wasn't even considered an epidemic because it was just a seasonal fact of life that once it hits summer, you're going to get a yellow fever outbreak, and the only thing that keeps it from reaching epidemic status is people leaving the city over the summer, right? Essentially social distancing before social distancing was cool. Or I guess it's a lot better if you can, go hang out at your plantation where enslaved people work for you. It makes it, it's horrible. The first time New Orleans does not have a summer outbreak, the first time that New Orleans does not have an outbreak of yellow fever is summer of 1862, which is not a coincidence that in April of 1862 is when the U.S. military captures New Orleans during the Civil War. And so New Orleans is under martial law. And so through orders of the U.S. Army, issues of no standing water being around, they don't know that it's mosquitoes, but they can sort of make a connection that good sanitary conditions help prevent spread of the disease. And so it's only the U.S. Army that's able to sort of enforce sanitary conditions to the extent that they actually don't end up with a disease outbreak. And similarly, the final sort of connection between mosquitoes and yellow fever is made, in part by Walter Reed. That's why we get Walter Reed Medical Center now to honor him. He was a U.S. Army surgeon who is in the late 19th century is the one that makes the connection through a bunch of experiments they do, actually on human testing, which is kind of messed up, that really make the connection between mosquitoes and the transmission of yellow fever. And so it's a slow process, one that is hindered by they essentially have this medium-sized organization, right? The U.S. Army is never a big organization throughout the 19th century, but it's bigger than pretty much any of the other federal agencies. And so in peacetime, it often would be tasked with sort of other duties as assigned to sort of backfill into positions that were needed that nowadays we would sign to a standing government agency, and that really changes at the start of the 20th century with Teddy Roosevelt. So the rise of the progressives are when they decide that this really shouldn't be done on an ad hoc basis. It really would be much more efficient if you had standing organizations that could take preemptive measures rather than be reactive to problems. So it really starts to, and I don't mean this in sort of a partisan way, but balloon up in the beginning of the 20th century.
Are there other Washingtonian leadership lessons we can take out of the yellow fever or other crises that you mentioned? So we have, from his standpoint, transparency. What you're just saying now, of taking preemptive measures, is another possible extraction. If we were to have these applicable leadership lessons, what else would you throw in there? And I think in some of our conversations, you've mentioned decisions around inoculating troops or not, and maybe talk about that as well.
Yeah, the inoculation one's sort of interesting. That's really something that occurs more during the war than during the peace after. But it's sort of, I actually just did a program last night for a museum in Florida. So 2 Florida connections there in 24 hours. About the inoculation part, a lot of people don't realize this, but the entire American Revolution was fought in the middle of an epidemic of smallpox in North America at that point. And inoculation had a very bad reputation in what's going to become the United States. Inoculation itself was a fairly dangerous procedure. More so to other people than yourself. It actually ends up outlawed in what are going to be the rebelling colonies by the time the American Revolution is outlawed. In part because you essentially, up to 2 weeks after you recovering from the smallpox, if that makes sense, there's about a 2-week period afterwards where you're asymptomatic but are still shedding a weak version of the virus. Of course, they don't know all that in the same terms that we would, I'm using to explain it, but they would notice that up to about 2 weeks later, if Bob was wandering around the town, people started getting sick. If they found out that Bob had inoculated himself, they're sort of able to put 2 and 2 together after a while. And so the reason it ends up being outlawed is because it can be a hazard to other people if you're self-inoculating. That doesn't mean it was ever not done. In fact, Washington himself gets his family inoculated, breaks the law. Right? He could in fact tell a lie and could in fact break the law if he needed to. And so he will get his kids inoculated. It ends up really being a problem for the Army in the war, throughout 1776. So 1776 is sort of famous normally for the fall of New York, and then eventually Trenton and Princeton, and then yay, nice victories. What gets left out lots of times is that basically the entire American army that was trying to invade Canada is wiped out by the smallpox virus. And that's really bad timing for Washington in the sense of he's finally that winter also gotten permission from Congress to start to recruit for more than 1 year at a time. So he's actually going to be able to build up a longer term service army. It's actually going to be able to have some institutional memory. They're not going to have to train new soldiers every year from scratch. They have a serious recruitment problem, though, because people say, well, wait, the conditions that make the virus spread the most are the exact conditions you would find in a military camp. So why would I want to join the army if there's a heightened chance that I'm going to die from the smallpox virus before I ever even get the chance to fight the British? And so it ends up, fear of the virus ends up hindering recruitment. And so Washington, guys like Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Franklin and Adams had both been inoculated to the virus. Washington had actually gotten smallpox when he was younger while visiting Barbados. So he got it naturally and had built up immunity from natural occurrence. And essentially Washington and others, including the Surgeon General of the Army, start a lobbying campaign to the various state governments, trying to highlight their plan for inoculating the army, that they're going to do it in a safe manner, that they're going to set people off away from population centers to sort of ride out the virus, ride out the recovery period. They're going to use the army to set up quarantines around these inoculation centers. And it's largely successful. And through the army showing how it could be done safely, it actually creates a lot more goodwill towards the idea of inoculation, so that by the end of the war, the epidemic's basically over, in part because they've managed to inoculate so many people. And it really doesn't make an appearance in smallpox really doesn't make an appearance in force until about 40 years later, when the immunities started to fade away from those initial inoculation efforts. To go back to your question of what would Washington think of the federal government today, I think he'd be surprised. I think he'd be quite pleased with some things and sort of scratching his head with others. I mean, I think one of the things that he would sort of scratch his head about is the proliferation of law enforcement agencies. One of the big fears of guys like Jefferson and stuff for so long, the reason they were so concerned about the idea of a large standing army was the large standing army would it's an armed force that could be a threat to the people. It creates, it's an armed group that can be used to police the people at will. Because in the 18th century, there's not really a distinction between a military force and a police force. And so throughout so much of the 18th century, the reason Washington's being told he can't have a larger army is because that's an organization that could be used as a large-scale police force. So I think for Washington, he'd kind of find it weird that then there's this proliferation of law enforcement agencies now that's just sort of accepted at face value. So that's just one I think he'd be sort of confused by and like a little more explanation of, just because it was a sort of weird policy thing that he was dealing with for so long. One thing I think he'd be, I can say with fair confidence, he'd be pleasantly surprised by is the professionalism of the federal workforce that we have now, and really the commitment a lot of government agencies show to really trying to continue professional development and continue training and really try and educate the workforce as much as possible. One of Washington's pet projects he was always angling for, but Democratic Republicans like Jefferson and Madison would never give him the votes for, was the establishment of essentially a civil service academy in the city of Washington, with the idea being it would be essentially a civil service version of West Point or Annapolis, that it would be a place where you could draw folks from all around the country to come to this one location, learn to work together, and it really, in some ways, sort of a full university version of things you'd see like now of like the Presidential Management Fellows, where there's just sort of efforts to get folks from different agencies to get to know each other. What Washington was sort of angling from the start was all of those folks would essentially go through college together and so already know each other. Then they would go back out to different agencies all around the country, but have sort of a shared unifying experience. So, I mean, we still don't have that, but, I think that, the federal government tries to get to that as much as possible.
Yeah, that's a fantastic segue, as I want to switch to how to apply leadership lessons, both in the federal government, but also the students and others in our chat. And so it sounds like, what you do at the Leadership Institute speaks to some version of what the President Washington pushed for. Our friends at the Partnership for Public Service I mentioned earlier play some sort of role in that. So even if there are a few different organizations in that space, some of that leadership development is happening. I'm wondering if that plays into the federal government's ability to lead in this sort of situation. I still know that some people think of the federal government, and it's probably true in a lot of instances, is very hierarchical, which is a leadership thing. But, we see, high level officials kind of directing, this is what needs to be said about the pandemic, or this is what the agency needs to be doing. And there are sometimes news articles about staff scientists and others who might not be agreeing. Is the leadership training that happens in the government and your perception of the value of leadership in federal government agencies uh, helping in some way our response to this? And does it vary from agency to agency? Is there resistance to it? What's the direct implication of how it looks today?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely varies agency by agency. And I think there's always going to be a tension there, right? Because on the one hand, we very rightly so, there's this notion of unelected bureaucrats shouldn't be making major decisions because they're not necessarily responsive to the whims of the people and the voters. But the counter argument to that would be that tension's a good thing, though, because at the same time, can you really develop long-range policy if every 4 years you're at risk of the policy being completely upended and overturned? So it's something that's always, I think, going to be an ongoing discussion. I mean, it's been an ongoing discussion since the beginning of the country. I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon, because I think it's something baked into the system, as it were. And the analogy or the example I'd sort of bring up with that is again the U.S. military, and it's a good one to bring up in the sense of if we think of what are considered the functions of the government, obviously the ability to declare and make war is one of the things that's always been sort of held at the federal level. So that's the one that in part one of the things the federal government has sort of the longest history of dealing with. And so, it's why you see with how we train the U.S. military, the distinction of there's the value. Every officer in the U.S. military goes through extensive professional military education throughout their career, not just officers enlisted as well. All members of the U.S. military go through extensive professional continuing training. But at the end of the day, a 4-star general with 20, 30 years of experience has to answer to the Secretary of Defense and the President of the United States, regardless of whether they have any experience as well. And that's in large part going to be true for, or it's supposed to be true for every federal agency, even the civilian ones. So it's definitely something that I think some agencies handle better than others. And I think the newer agencies sometimes tend to struggle with it the most because there's not the institutional memory as built up. A lot of the newer agencies are often established to deal with a very specific crisis and then find themselves having to sort of settle into a steady state existence. And so maybe they're used to being able to call the shots a little more because they're dealing with things that are more timely at the moment they're established, but then have to sort of deal with not quite being at the front burner of the needs of the federal government. So I think it's definitely a mix, but it's a tension that is not going to go away anytime soon because it's been there since the beginning of the country, and something that every agency, as it sort of comes online, has to deal with.
Before opening it up to questions, I don't want anyone here to miss out on some of your other standard leadership lessons, even as it pertains to their own organizations and lives. Some of our students run student organizations, own businesses, etc. And so as a lesser or different sort of crisis might emerge in those organizations, or as it pertains to simply how they understand what's going on with the federal government today and make decisions about if they approve or disapprove. Any last leadership takeaways that our in-person groups might hear from you, even extracted from the crisis scenario, that you want to make sure to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think the number one is communication. I think so many people. I mean, I can tell you, Mount Vernon, just trying to deal with our own response to when do we reopen, how do we reopen, how do we do it safely. The problem is that we're just not getting good, clear communication. from the federal government. We get conflicting information from the state governments, from our local government here in Fairfax County, because there's not just sort of one message or sort of one cohesive voice. And it's not so that it has to be just one voice, but we're just not sure what information to go off of. And that's something that, Washington was not very much not the winningest battlefield general in the world or throughout the war. And that's somewhat on purpose. The Continental Army and the plan for the American Revolution was not to go out and win a lot of battlefield victories. It's designed to fight a war of attrition, but that's also for policymakers not exactly a sexy policy proposal, right? We want to take a lot of time. Right? You think of what the Continental Army is proposing to Congress is we want to take a lot of time and spend quite a bit of money to eventually succeed at something at a date in the future that we can't tell you right now. But we can guarantee you it's going to take quite a bit of time. Policymakers generally want quick results, or elected officials generally want quick results. And so what helped Washington not just sell that plan from the start, but continue to sort of maintain buy-in, whether it was from the elected officials he worked for, or whether it was amongst the civilian population or his own soldiers, was just constant, clear, as much as he could, clear, consistent communication, just being honest with them of where they stand at the moment, what the situation is, what the best practices they need to take forward are. And that's, I think, something that whether you're running a student organization or running the federal government now, just consistent, clear communication that can be trusted. And to build that trust requires a tremendous effort on the front end to build credibility. And I think that's something that for anybody, any organization, or just on an individual level, building that credibility on the front end is just so worthwhile, because that way when you have to make a hard ask or say, I can't answer that right now for whatever reason, that it can be trusted why you're not doing it. And that credibility is so easy to lose so quickly. And it takes a long time to build up and recover. And I think that's one of the things that as a historian worries me the most in some ways. This country has been through economic crises before. It's been through, medical crises before. But this credibility and communication is so lacking that I do worry about the long-term implications of that are for everyone.
Thanks. So we're going to open it up. All the questions I've seen so far relate to how to apply this today, which makes sense. That's what we were hoping for. One that was chatted privately, since there's some audio issues, is specific to the safety-liberty tension. So Meg, who's here listening, is curious about the present tension between safety and liberty. I think we see that in many contexts when the national security realm, but specifically here, she's asking about, as many citizens advocate for reopening businesses, even when that might be risking safety. What would President Washington say about giving up certain liberties to ensure public safety?
Washington, this is one of those interesting things where when you hear folks talk about, the founders as a monolithic group, they absolutely were not. And Washington definitely would have fallen into the camp of, how do I put this? You're going to do what I say, but because you're going to trust that it's the right thing to do, if that makes sense. So I think, it's always hard to sort of take, a completely current event and sort of backwards analyze it into, the past. But, Washington definitely was a rule of law person in many senses. So his main gripe with the Whiskey Rebellion, he understands why these farmers in Western Pennsylvania are upset over, the excise tax. But his argument is that, this is something that, your duly elected officials have come up with, that's been voted on. You don't get the opportunity to just self-nullify, because if everyone can just self-nullify, then there is no rule of law, and the laws can't be enforced equally. And so, I think in terms of the liberty versus stay at home, I think in some ways that's a false dichotomy. Collective good is in part why we come together to form communities and form governments. And so, I think for Washington, it would be you're going to do it if it's in the best interest of everybody, but only call it into effect if it's really needed, if that makes sense.
Thanks. So I see both Melissa and James have been participating in the chat and had questions that also pertain to direct application. I'm going to see if they want to back say anything over video or ask anything over video, since they are likely related. Then you can address anything they have to say. Melissa, did you still want to ask anything?
Well, a lot was answered, but now another question popped into my mind is like, science and politics have been clashing in modern times. I guess there wasn't this problem as much years ago, but now that science is more advanced, politicians base their decisions in their judgment and not into the science. And I was wondering, how can we merge the two to make it a process? So there's not so much like one state decides on one thing, another state decides on another, on a personal opinion, and it's not all, together. So I was just wondering if there's something that it can be done to change that.
A lot of James's comments in the chat. I'll see if he wants to come on video. I'll also get to this issue of the state versus federal governments, which is something I'm sure Dr. Stoltz studies a lot and was big in Washington's time. James, is there anything you wanted to add on to that, and Joe can address them both at once?
The whole states thing of, the National Guard used to be controlled and actually paid by the states. They're not anymore. The states have given up so much. They've become like children in many ways. They've kind of given up their essence of being at that level. And it's showing in this pandemic. They're always pointing to Washington to bail them out. FEMA's job is not to bail out states who fail to plan and who fail to stockpile. That was my comment. My personal thing is, how do we use these historical events? And by the way, that's awesome. I did not know about the smallpox and the revolution going on at the same time. My reference is World War I, where they fought 5 years with gas masks and had to do 3 years of the pandemic of 1918. Why is it our ancestors have so much more resiliency than we do? And how do we use these historical events to try to give our current society even a fraction of the resiliency that our ancestors seem to have had? And I know that's a lot of stuff.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you for your questions and comments. Joe, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes we have a nostalgic appreciation for the past. The friction between government and science is nothing new in many ways. I mean, even with you, just take a moment. I mean, the sort of general era that the American Revolution is taking place in is sort of often called the Age of Reason, or the Enlightenment period, where they're not gonna condemn people like Galileo for arguing that the Earth is the center of the universe. That's still around though in the 18th century. That is by no means everything is all of a sudden science-based, and frankly, sociological and cultural conditions on the ground have been issues. So like when the first sort of really major smallpox epidemic in what's going to become the United States occurs in the 1720s, and New England, right, because of places like Harvard, has access to some of the most up-to-date scientific information in the country, because the professors at Harvard are in regular communication with their colleagues in England. And in England, they have been doing some experiments with this thing, that's going to be called inoculation. Inoculation had already made its way to the U.S., or to what's going to become, right? It had already made its way to the American colonies through enslaved Africans, because enslaved Africans that had been enslaved by slave traders, European slave traders, had actually sort of made its way over through Africa and Islam, because it had already been a known remedy for certain types of diseases in the Middle East. So when New Englanders hear about inoculation from, that this is something that, scientists in, or sort of what are going to become scientists are working on in England as a possible cure for smallpox, there's a huge debate in New England over, well, wait, that's something that like brown people do. And is that something that's socially acceptable for good, upstanding Protestant white New Englanders to do if enslaved Africans are doing it and Native Americans are doing it? Those are people that practice heathen religions. And at this point, New England is very, very much Puritan, right? Which is a sort of a Calvinist predestination-centered theology. And so, does inoculating yourself and giving yourself a weakened version of the disease early, is that messing up God's plan for you? And so inoculation was, on the one hand, leading science, and you had some very smart, educated people in New England, pushing for it. But there was a large public backlash against it early on, because it was, seen as something that might be contradictory to their religion. And it's not really until both people that were both a religious and science leader, like Cotton Mather, sort of buy in on it and help sell it to the population, that it's sort of accepted. And I mean, certainly throughout the 19th century, there can be, there were tensions between religion and science. Think of things like the famous ACLU in its early 20th century, but the debates over teaching evolution in the classroom. And then at the same time, in the 19th century, and frankly into the 20th century, you can make an argument for sometimes lashing yourself too closely to whatever is the current science, in the sense of, right, science is something that's constantly changing and evolving as we learn new things. And some of the intellectual paths that science takes, I'm thinking here of things, different studies of race and issues like that, that then end up getting built into government policy in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And so, I think I don't want to say the problem with science-based decisions, but that there can be dangers there, because science itself, as scientists make new discoveries, science isn't settled. They're constantly learning new things. So I think there is even a tension there that, we need to, work with the latest information, but also be willing to accept that information can change at any moment. And that's not a bad thing, if that makes sense.
Definitely. And
and in terms of the state versus federal, that's something that, when we look at the epidemic response to smallpox, the federal government's not involved in that at all. In part, because there's just not a lot to the federal government. The famous smallpox outbreak in Philadelphia is sort of, it's the most famous of the smallpox outbreaks in that time, because one, a tenth of the population of Philadelphia dies from it, which is not a good reason a valid reason to be remembered. But it's also, Philadelphia is also the capital of the country at that point. Congress wasn't in session in the summer that it broke out. Congress had already adjourned for the summer. Washington goes on his previously scheduled summer vacation to Mount Vernon. So he slips out of the city. He's already scheduled to do cornerstone laying for the new U.S. Capitol building that's going to be constructed. So he has a convenient reason to get out of town. And frankly, the state legislature in Philadelphia, the state legislature of Pennsylvania at that point, the capital is Philadelphia as well, it adjourns. It actually adjourns because of the epidemic, because it was seen as something that only the city was dealing with. And so for a lot of the epidemiological outbreaks of smallpox, they mostly occurred in port cities and were treated as very local affairs. Now, it's easier for them to do that in the 18th century because you don't have, rapid transit. So if Philadelphia ends up with the outbreak, New York and Baltimore both shut their borders to anybody from Philadelphia. The citizens of Maryland actually set up a checkpoint at what's now Havre de Grace. If you've ever been stuck on I-95, that basically can still be a checkpoint today just because of traffic. So a lot of these things were, it wasn't considered the federal government's role because they were things that didn't necessarily spread that fast to end up needing some sort of federal response, and the states would still end up with conflicting responses with each other because the federal government's just not set up to really adjudicate a dispute at that point.
Well, thank you. I think that answer and our whole conversation today achieved our mission of connecting the past to the present and using some leadership lessons and examples from our past to contextualize and understand what's going on today. Those seem to be all the questions from our group. I want to acknowledge a few FIU colleagues for joining because of their relevance here. As we saw in the chat that Professor Jean Rosenberg provided some additional insights onto smallpox inoculation at the time, and Dr. Rosenberg is a well-renowned professor of biological sciences and a good friend, so we're glad he's here to chat in on that. Shannon Hansen is with our Center for Leadership. So for those in the chat that have particularly enjoyed the leadership lessons portion of this and want more of that, our FIU Center for Leadership is a great resource, lead.fiu.edu. They host tons of events like this as well. And my good friend Taylor from the Office of Global Learning Initiatives, who is a great partner in promoting all of our events. And of course, and if you have any closing comments, you're welcome to them. I want to be sure to thank you, Dr. Joel Stoltz, for this conversation today and for all of the partnership between Mount Vernon and FIU in supporting the mission of getting students experiences in DC and professionally developing them while they're there. So Dr. Stoltz, anything you didn't get to say or any closing remarks about our partnership?
Go Panthers.
I agree. All right. Thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Stoltz.
Thank you.